And we begin with a quick summary of the Old Testament material. And this lesson we're going to finish the life of Abraham and then introduce and summarize and overview the lives of Isaac and Jacob. And I want to begin and summarize the life of Abraham as we started last lesson. We saw his conversion, Ur the Chaldees, and his sevenfold promise. I don't think I referred to those in the last lesson. I will make you a great nation. I'll bless you, make your name great. You'll be a blessing. Bless them that bless thee. I'll curse him who curseth thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And it's no accident that in the book of Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, the New Testament opens up with the words, Jesus Christ, the Son of Abraham. In thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Number 2, at Haran, his partial obedience, where God tells him to leave Ur the land of Chaldees and go to Canaan, but he gets bogged down in the city of Haran. Finally, though, at the death of his father, he arrives in Canaan, and one of the first things he does, he builds an altar. And one of these altars he'll call by the name of Bethel, which means house of God. Unfortunately, though, he hadn't been there very long, and there was a famine in the land, and he left the land of Canaan, and he made his way to Egypt and all kinds of problems down there. You know, he believed that God would take care of him to bring him into Canaan, but during a famine he didn't have enough faith to stay in Canaan. But the results here you'll see on your notes. What he did there, he grieved God, he weakened his own faith and that of his Sarah, his wife, and he became a poor testimony to his nephew Lot. He caused the Pharaoh to be afflicted. He picked up Hagar, the Egyptian handmaid, and he provided a bad example for his son Isaac. And so one's life is like a pool of water, and a sin is like throwing a stone into the water, and the ripples are seemingly never ending. Well, he comes back, of course, and there he spends most of his life now, with one exception, going to Philistia later in time of a famine. But he goes to war, and on the way back to rescue Lot, and you can read this in your notes, and on the way back he meets Melchizedek. We're not sure who Melchizedek was. Some believe he was simply a godly priest, the king of Jerusalem. Some think he may have been Shem, which had been the oldest person on earth at that time, 600 years of age. There are others who think he was an angelic being, and some believe that he was Christ himself. But he's a very mysterious, a very important character, Melchizedek. And then, number 6, he has his covenant that God had made with him ratified by blood. And this is called the Abrahamic covenant. Now, it's the most important of the three. Actually, it's the first of the three most important covenants in the Bible. It's called the Abrahamic covenant, and had to do with two things, with seed and soil. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of a mighty nation, that seed, and someday that he would give the land of Canaan to the descendants of Abraham, to that seed to live upon, and that's soil. Number 7. In Genesis 16, his marriage to Hagar. And this was another big mistake, even bigger than going to Egypt in the first place, because he will father a boy through Hagar, and the boy's name is Ishmael. Ishmael then will be the founder of the Arab nations, and later on Isaac will be born, and he will be the founder of the Jewish people. And 4,000 years later today, you have the descendants of these two boys trying to kill each other. In Genesis 17, he has his name changed along with his wife. Abram, which means exalted father, now becomes Abraham, father of nations. And Sarah, which means contentious, she was sort of frustrated all these years without being a mother. She may not have been that easy to live with. Now she becomes Sarah, a princess. And then a new seal is given. Circumcision now becomes the sign of God's covenant. Not the source. Faith was the source, but this is the sign now, circumcision of God's covenant. Well, in chapters 18 and 19, God appears to Abraham with good news and bad news. The good news is, Abraham, you've been waiting for almost 25 years. You're 99. Your wife is 89. But this time next spring, in other words, this was probably in the fall, and so in the next 9 months, your son, long-promised son, is going to be born. That was the good news. The bad news is I'm going to have to destroy the city of Sodom because of its sin. Well, that broke Abraham's heart because his nephew Lot was there, and so at any rate, angels come, and if you remember the story, they finally convince Lot and his 2 unmarried daughters to escape the wrath of God, but even his wife and married daughters are killed. And number 10, Abraham in Philistia, that's Genesis 20. The second time he does the same thing during a famine. He again leaves Canaan, and he lies about Sarah. And let me just tell you that once you commit a sin, not always, but once you commit a sin, often it is easier to commit the same sin the second time. And then number 11, the heir of the covenant, Genesis 21, Isaac is born. And his name literally means laughter, because when God promised Abraham in his old age, you will bear a son, Abraham laughed in belief. Thank God, that's wonderful. But Sarah snorted unbelief. She said, it'll never happen. But he said, God said, call his name Isaac, and that'll be a reminder of the boy and the daddy and the mom regarding the circumstances surrounding his birth. The heir of the covenant, Genesis 22, one of the great chapters in all the Bible. You have the foreshadows of Calvary, and you have Abraham taking his son Isaac up Mount Moriah to offer him as a sacrifice. Now, about halfway up there, Isaac knows, of course, he's going to participate in he knows they're going to offer a sacrifice. What he doesn't know is that he's going to be the sacrifice. And so about halfway up, he said, Dad, he said, we're getting forgetful in our old age. He said, we've got the rope, we got the knife. He said, we got the fire, but we forgot the lamb. Where is the lamb? Well, that just broke Abraham's heart, I'm sure. And he said, my son, God will provide himself a lamb. And they got to the top of the mountain. Of course, there was a ram up there, and God said, don't kill your son. Slay the ram in lieu of your son. But notice the question that Isaac asked, where is the lamb? I want to tell you, 2,000 years ago by the Jordan River, John the Baptist would answer Isaac's question. As he pointed to Jesus and said, behold the lamb. The Bible is a story about the lamb. Where is the lamb? Behold the lamb. And Revelation chapter 5, someday all believers will gather around the throne of God, and we will sing, not where is the lamb, or even behold the lamb. We will sing, worthy is the lamb to receive glory and honor and power, etc. And I like to say this, that I think there's a difference between saving faith and sanctifying faith. Saving faith is in Genesis 15 and Genesis 12 and 15, where God told him to go somewhere, land of Canaan. He'd never seen it, but he believed God. And saving faith, I think, is believing something that you can't see. I've never seen hell, never seen heaven, never seen Jesus, but I believe. Saving faith, believing something you can't see. But here in Genesis 22, the boy becomes a man. Real faith, I think, sanctifying faith, major league faith, is believing not just what you can't see, but what you can't understand. All right. And then in chapter 23, you have the death of Sarah. She dies at the age of 127 and buried in the cave of Machpelah, located near the city of Hebron. And later on, Abraham will be buried there, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Joseph. A whole slew of early Israelite patriarchs will be or have been buried there. Chapter 24, Abraham realizes now it's time for his son to get married, and he doesn't want him to marry a Philistine hussy, as it were. So he sends his servant, probably not mentioned, probably the name of Eliezer, back to his hometown of Nahor in Mesopotamia to fetch a bride. Well, he gets there, the servant gets there, and all these girls are running around looking very pretty. And he said, oh, God, show me the right one. And here's what I'd like, dear Lord. Let whoever you want me to take back to Isaac, let her come to me ask if I would like a drink of water, and ask also if she could slacken the thirst of my camels, which would probably be about a 3-hour job, because these camels drink a lot of water. And so then the Bible says, even as he was praying, and what a blessing that's been to my life, Rebekah came out. And then he explained to her, and she asked both questions, volunteered. He explained to her then the sign that he had given, who he was, why he was there. She goes back with him, and then later on, of course, Rebekah and Isaac become married, man and wife. In chapter 25, we have a very brief record of his third wife. Sarah was the first, of course. If we count Hagar as not only a mistress but a wife, was the second. And Keturah was the third. She bore him 6 sons. And the fourth was a boy that they called Midian. And years later, Moses, the descendant of Abraham through Sarah, met and married Zipporah, a descendant of Abraham through Keturah. So God he works in mysterious ways. And then number 16, you have his death at age 175, and he's buried in the cave at Machpelah. The Jewish rabbis and early Christian theologians have long since agreed that the 3 greatest men in the Old Testament, probably the 3 greatest men of all time up to the New Testament era, was Abraham, Moses, and David. And we're going to let the book of Hebrews at the close of this session sort of summarize Abraham's life. All right, we go from Abraham to Isaac, his son. And we're going to give a 5-fold overview of Isaac's life. The submissive son, he willingly allows his father to offer him up. I don't think he was 8 or 9 years old. He could have been late teens, early 20s. He could have run away. But the submissive son. And then later on, the gentle groom. He meets Rebekah. He waits for her. And when the servant brings her back, and they become man and wife. They've been married for about 20 years and no children. She seemed to be barren, so he prayed, "Oh, God, send us a son." And God double answered that prayer, because God gives Rebekah, twin boys, Esau and Jacob. And we'll talk about that a little later when we come to Jacob's life. So you have the submissive son, the gentle groom, the copycat. Isaac repeats the sin of his father, and during a famine, and this time, instead of going to Egypt, this time he will, as his father did the second time, he would go to Philistia. You see, if I do something, not only is it easier for me to commit the same sin the second time, but also it becomes a bad testimony to my son and or daughter, and they may be tempted to do the same thing. And then Isaac, the willing worker. Isaac was known for one thing, basically, and that's redigging, clearing out the debris of his wells that the Philistines had filled up. And there's a significant lesson here, and I have this, and you can read it in your notes. The young minister of God, or man or woman, child of God, can derive some profitable lessons from these verses where Isaac redug these wells now. Throughout history, our spiritual forefathers had, with patience and pleasure, dug down deep into the Word of God and beautifully exposed those clear, fresh, cold water wells of the virgin birth, the sinless life of Christ, his vicarious death, resurrection, ascension, and his second coming. But of late, about 100 years ago, with evolution and with higher criticism in Europe, these wells have been clogged in the minds of many because of the hateful actions of false critics, the 21st century Philistines. Therefore, the main job of the young man or woman of God today, or old man or woman of God today for that matter, is to clean out these wells. You don't have to redig them and dig new ones. You just clean out these wells, that the life-giving fluids may once again satisfy the parched hearts of humanity. Hopefully that'll be one of the most important lessons we will learn today. All right, so you have the submissive son, the gentle groom, the copycat, the willing worker, and the frustrated father. Isaac, at age 137, He feels his death is near, and he instructs his favorite son Esau to prepare him a venison meal that he might eat and bestow the patriarchal blessing. Well, Rebekah hears this, and her favorite son is Jacob, and so she tricks her father into giving her, she tricks her husband and the father of Jacob into giving Jacob the blessing. He disguises himself as Esau walks in and gets the blessing. Well, upon learning of this, when Esau comes in, then he decides, I'm going to kill Jacob. And later on, and we'll see this when we come to the life of Jacob, Jacob has to leave because of this deception. Now, it is true that even at birth, at the moment of birth, God predicted that even though Esau was firstborn, and then Jacob probably a couple of minutes later, that the younger, and that would be Jacob, would be served by the older, and not the other way around. Usually the first person out of the womb, he receives the blessing and etc. But in this case, it's going to be the younger one. And so she did a right thing, but she did it in the wrong way. God would have taken care of that. And I've learned a few things in the 50-plus years since I've been a Christian, and I've learned this, that the end never justifies the means. In other words, it is never right to do wrong to bring about right. The bottom line is this: God, and boy have I had to learn this in my life the hard way sometimes, God has both a will and a way. He has a will for my life, but he has a way for me to accomplish that will. So you have the submissive son, the gentle groom, the copycat, the willing worker, and the frustrated father. Then we go to Jacob, and we have a tenfold overview quickly of Jacob's life. We see him first as the devising brother. He pressures Esau, as they're teenage boys, into trading his birthright. So he'll cheat him out of his birthright, teenage years, and then later on out of the blessing. And then the deceitful son, he tricks his father to receive the blessing. As we said before, when Esau finds out about this, he swears that he will kill, takes a vow to kill his brother Jacob. So Jacob has to leave, and his mother and dad send Jacob back to his mother's hometown there in Nahor in Mesopotamia. And en route, he becomes the dreaming pilgrim. He sees a ladder set up from earth to heaven at Bethel. An angel are ascending and descending upon it. This is really the first, probably the second key example of that passage in Hebrew where it says that the angels of God are ministering spirits to the heirs of salvation. In fact, in Genesis 3, we have the first instance of these angels. They're called the cherubims, when they guarded the way lest Adam and Eve go back into the garden, eat of the tree of life, and live forever in their sin. So these angels now are speaking, and angels are ministering in some marvelous way, mysterious way perhaps, to Jacob. Well, God then confirms to him the Abrahamic covenant, and upon awakening, he anoints, that is he, Jacob, a rock pile to serve God. The devising brother, the deceitful son, the dreaming pilgrim, the love-struck suitor. And Genesis 29 and 30 is a very interesting passage there, because when he gets back to his mother's hometown, he meets Rachel, his cousin, and his future wife beside a well. And here begins one of history's great love stories, and he promises Rachel's father, Laban, which is Jacob's uncle and future father-in-law, that he will work 7 years for her hand in marriage, and he does, but he is deceived. He becomes now the frustrated family man because he's deceived on his wedding night by Laban, who secretly substitutes Leah, Rachel's older sister, for Rachel. Rachel must have been very, very beautiful, and Leah, in the, I suppose, the terminology of the young people today, may have been a bow wow, and so I guess he didn't want to feed her Alpo food or whatever, and so he's furious. But he agrees to work yet another 7 years for Rachel. Well, he now has 2 wives and would gather yet another 2 for both Rachel and Leah, present to him their personal handmaids for childbearing purposes. And these 4 women will bear Jacob 12 sons and 1 daughter. And you can see this on chart 12. But let me just say that it's interesting that Leah, the one he didn't really love at all, gave him 6 of his 12 sons and the only 1 recorded daughter. And these 2 sons, 2 of these 6 sons, would be Levi, who would be the founder of the priests of Israel, and Judah, who would be the founder of the kings. And so I'm not sure whether it's God's original will for him to marry Leah. I don't know. Well, Rachel finally does bear children. She gives him son number 11 and son number 12, Joseph and Benjamin. And we'll see later on she dies during giving birth to the final child, Benjamin. All right, then we see Jacob as the enterprising employee, and he goes in business with his father-in-law, becomes a wealthy man, but they can't get along, so he finally leaves without telling Laban in the middle of the night. Laban catches up with him, and they come to a truce there in the desert and build a memorial pile of stones. And then Jacob, the determined wrestler, one of the most, mysterious passages in all the Bible. But on the way back to Israel, to Canaan, he learns that Esau is on his way to meet him with 400 men, and he's terrified, and so he wrestles with God, a stream called Jabbok, as it flows into the tributary of the Jordan River. And there God meets with him, wrestles with him all night, and then God touches him and his hip, and he never walks the same after that. And God also changes his name from Jacob, which means crooked used car salesman maybe, to that of Israel, which means one who has prevailed with God. Then you have Jacob, the enraged father. Jacob was not a good father. His sons committed murder and adultery and deceit. He was not a good father. Jacob, then, the obedient patriarch, he's ordered by God not only just to go back to Canaan, but go back to Bethel, and he does that. And in Genesis 35, you have the first recorded revival in the Bible, where Jacob, then they take their household gods and they burn them and destroy them, and revival takes place. Jacob, the obedient patriarch, and then Jacob, finally, the sorrowing saint. He loses his beloved wife Rachel, who dies in childbirth at Bethlehem, giving birth to Benjamin. He buries his father Isaac, and he's led to believe that Joseph has been killed and eaten by a wild beast. And I think we're doing okay. We will take a couple minutes and just quickly overview the life of Joseph. You have Joseph, the favored son. He was the very favorite of the 12 of his father Jacob. And but they sell him into slavery, you remember, because they were jealous of him. But in prison, he's a faithful steward, and he gets the approval of the warden, and he has a real testimony there. And eventually, through some providential intervention, he's released from prison. And Pharaoh, as he interprets one of Pharaoh's dreams, Pharaoh will eventually make him second in command over all of the land. And then you have the forgiving saint. There's a famine in the land, and Joseph is the superintendent of all the food, and people from all over the Middle East come there, and they think he's dead, but they recognize Joseph's brothers do not recognize him, but he recognizes them when they come for food. And finally, he reveals himself that he is the long-lost brother that they thought was dead. And then at the invitation of Joseph, then the entire clan, Jacob on down, move into Israel. And then you have the fruitful shade tree, one of the last blessings that his father Jacob gave on his deathbed to his sons. He gives to Joseph. And he said, Joseph is a fruitful bough by a well whose branches run over the wall. His hands were made strong by the mighty God. The Almighty shall bless thee with the blessings of heaven above. Well, let me, as I say, a couple of minutes here, and I think one of the great overviews of the Bible concerning the lives of these three men is found in Hebrews chapter 11, beginning with verse 8. By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for inheritance, obeyed and went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundation, whose builder and maker is God. Through faith also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed, and was delivered with a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. And then by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. And by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph, and worshipped leaning upon the top of his staff. So the story turns out okay for these three men, Abraham, Isaac, actually four, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. They all are mentioned here in the Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith.